I'm going to dive straight in. As we saw last time, it's from the severed Medusa's neck that Asclepius takes the twin vials of medication that heals and poison that kills. And we have Freud's short, I hesitate to call it essay, piece from 1922 in which he doesn't mess around. It's very Freudian. The decapitated Medusa's head represents the female genitals. Essentially, Freud says, the mothers, for to decapitate equals to castrate. And it's the terror of this sight that turns the viewer to stone. The hair on the Medusa's head is, Freud states, frequently represented by snakes. We can, I think, say always. I haven't come across an instance where it's not. And as he says about these snakes, it is a remarkable fact that, however frightening they may be in themselves, they nevertheless serve actually as a mitigation of the horror, for they replace the penis, the absence of which is the cause of the horror, of the possibility of castration. So we can see that these snakes serve to both reference castration and mitigate it by replacing the absent penis they invoke. As such, they constitute a type of fetish object, which doesn't just cover up, but references this absence. We can trace again a pharmacon-like logic at play here in this fetish role, the snakes serving to both induce horror and provide an antidote to it. A double relationship that might allow us to understand the type of jouissance derived from the fetish object a little better, and its relation to disavowal, which isn't foreclosure. We know that the snake figures again and again in reference to medical practice in the ancient world, in Greece and beyond. To confine my references to two figures I'm going to be discussing in this video, the name Asclepius is a derivation of Ascalabos, snake, and, as I've noted, his rod is frequently depicted with a snake coiled around it. And as we're going to see in regard to the figure of Melampus, two snakes will provide him with the knowledge of the real that allows him to carry out his function as an iatros, indeed the first mortal iatros. We have the question, why? Why should the snake exist in this close relationship to medical practice? The traditional answer centres on something like the snake is a natural symbol of renewal because it sheds its skin periodically to rejuvenate itself. And sometimes with this, the curative capacity of venom makes the snake a symbol of pharmacy and medicine. How satisfying are these answers, though? Is that all there is to it? They need to be set against the fact that, as we know, the snake can present a threat to humans. It can be venomous, it can kill. It's been associated with perfidy and treachery. Often these are its more typical associations. So why this positioning as a symbol of medical practice? Freud will note how, in the interpretation of dreams, snakes present those most important symbols of the male organ, and how the presence of multiple snakes in the place of the Medusa's hair conforms with the technical rule according to which a multiplication of penis symbols signifies castration. Something Flugel's 1924 paper on polyphallic symbolism does much to draw out. We are in the domain then of penis symbols, of phallic symbolism, and yes, we can say that the notion of phallic symbolism has long passed from seeming psychoanalytic cliché to cliché, and alongside this threatened to take on the status of a pancreston. As Lacan will attest in Seminar 7, all the absurd things that have been said about symbolism do nevertheless lead us somewhere. There is something hidden there, and it is always, we are told, the damned phallus. It's not unusual to hear analysans complain of this when the question arises of speaking about the phallus, to articulate their reluctance of speaking in terms that fit with what they regard as psychoanalytic cliché, something we can see as one, constituting a defence against speaking about the phallus, something which very often troubles people, as well as two, the fear of being reduced to the other's most obvious articulations, clichés. The problem is that the truth isn't adverse or allergic to so-called cliché. It really doesn't care. As Lacan makes clear in his 1959 text on Ernest Jones and symbolism, in symbolism we're dealing with a signifier, and more particularly metaphor, and a signifier enunciated by the subject, a signifier that has to be situated in the context of the subject's singularity rather than as phylogenetic or archetypal. And it's in these terms that Lacan refuses the second part of Jones's claim that a bell tower can be a penis, but a penis can't be a bell tower. My initial reaction to the latter was, can it? In what circumstances? But for Artemidorus, whose interpretation of dreams we're going to be returning to in a moment, if we turn to the discussion of sexual acts in Book 1, these acts are entirely positioned as predictive of what will happen in areas other than the sexual of the dreamer's life. In his 1959 text, Lacan reminds us that the snake, a black snake, constitutes the earliest example of symbolism in psychoanalysis, given its appearance in the case of Anna O as she sits at her sick father's bedside, in regard to which he declares, "This snake is the symbol of the phallus and nothing else," revising this in his 1966 ex post facto syllabary to state that this snake is the symbol of the place where the penis is missing. These twin statements point us towards the presence and absence of the phallus. As we know, for Lacan, this isn't reducible to the presence-absence of, to use Freud's term, the male organ, as in the real penis, but more than this, denote the imaginary and symbolic dimensions of the phallus. We'll leave aside the question of the extent of the clarity with which the phallus is divisible into these three versions. Lacan's turn to the imaginary and symbolic dimensions of the phallus is concomitant with the shift his work presents in the treatment, coming to a halt on the rock of castration and penis need. 2, taking the subject's assumption of their castration as integral, as crucial to it. And if we turn now to Artemidorus' work, we find there a series of instances of the snake as it appears in dreams from the Greco-Roman world. I want to add that if we can position Socrates as the first proto-analyst, or the first to be able to assume the position of the analyst, see for instance seminars 6 and 8, it's Artemidorus whose text presents the only fully surviving work on dreams from this world, who directly addresses these formations of the unconscious, and he attempts to interpret them in ways that, if not psychoanalytic, at one level they're concerned with the predictive function of dreams, remain richly suggestive for the analyst, including in regard to the use he makes of homophony. In regard to this, it's hard not to titter at the incredulity expressed in a recent introduction to Artemidorus' work at interpretations based on nothing more than wordplay, something the author notes was an obsession of the ancient world. Further examples are supplied from Cicero and Plato. In Artemidorus, we can say that we find the snake configured as metaphor for the series of the different guises Lacan conceives the phallus assuming. To take one major instance from Book 2, a big snake signifies a king, master of a house, a magistrate because of its power, and wealth in goods and money, so that when such a snake approaches and gives the dreamer something, or says by its tongue that it has no aggressive intent, it signifies great benefits to come. To which he adds, but a snake acting in the opposite way is malign. A snake that coils around someone and binds him tight foretells debts and imprisonment, and for the sick it foretells death. Yes, it's true, we're somewhat removed here from locating the snake as metaphor at the level of the singularity of the subject's enunciation or dreaming. But our concern right here isn't with a subject, but medical insignia deployed at another level, the social. In this section of Artemidorus' text, then, we have firstly the snake as a metaphor for capital Phi, that relays a portion of the elements of the phallus. Artemidorus introduces in the section the body, penis, in Book 1 of his work, a masterful bringing together of many of the manifestations of capital Phi, to which this section on the big snake adds the dimension of giving, and in signifying a magistrate references the law. And then secondly, with the snake acting in the opposite way, invoking debt, imprisonment, death, we have the snake figuring as an avatar of, if we like, minus phi, imaginary castration. There are further instances I could draw upon that position the snake as signifier of the real and imaginary phallus, as in phi, not minus phi, including in regard to the dreams of women who give birth to snakes in Book 4, in which the snake's relation to the dreamer's subjectivity is foregrounded. But it seems clear that the snake as metaphor, and raising at least the question of metaphor's relation to condensation, Verdichtung, the snake as metaphor as we find it here foreshadows the different guises the phallus will assume in Lacan's work. As we looked at last time, we can locate the relation and movement between the two versions of the phallus. Artemidorus' discussion of the big snake invokes minus phi to capital Phi that occurs in the move from the second to third moments of Oedipus as a key vector in the iatros's function as healer and their relation to the father as function. This can be extended, though, to give a fuller picture of this process to include the first moment of Oedipus. In this first moment, the child subject is located as being, or being able to be, the phallus for the mother. The case of little hands provides one demonstration of the terms in which this can be problematic for the subject. The schizophrenia's other instances of this. This sequence from first to second to third moment of Oedipus doesn't present two core a or the simple formula for the progress of the treatment in analysis, but it does constitute a crucial and necessary vector in this process, that of the subject taking on, of assuming their castration. With the inclusion of the third moment of Oedipus and the emergence of capital Phi, one could say that this is applicable only to the neuroses and perversions. And yet we find the move to the invocation of capital Phi, at least in terms of a reference point or guiding light, as often vital in the treatment of the psychoses. Yes. We can say then that the snake, in the different guises it can assume, as we encounter it, at the very least in Artemidorus, can be taken as a metaphor for these movements from Phi to minus Phi and from minus Phi to capital Phi. Not only does this allow us to better understand why the snake has figured as a symbol of medical practice, if we return then to the scene of Asclepius and the two vials, the originary myth of medication as I'm situating it, this medication is taken from a point, the neck, that's contiguous with or possibly framed by the Medusa snakes, suggesting that medication emerges, comes into being, exists alongside or is framed by not simply real castration as presented by the mother's castration, as Freud positions these snakes denoting, and the horror this gives rise to, which shouldn't be discounted, but more than this, the process or moments of castration as Lacan conceives them that I've just outlined. As we saw in the previous video, the relation of the iatros to the father as function invokes the former's relation to castration, in regard to which we can ask, does this include their role as medicine giver? This opens onto the question I now want to turn to, the relation of medication to castration, and whether, and in what terms, we can speak of medication itself figuring as an agent of castration. Okay, as I noted last time, we can connect the signifier pharmakon to phalos, plough, and pharynx, throat, as well as the Proto-Indo-European for cut, pierce, scrape, and Latin for hit, slay, strike, which have in part been taken as referencing the collecting of medicinal plants and roots, but in which we might now want to hear something more. Let me point to the collecting of two medications that's interesting in this regard. Firstly, mistletoe. Mistletoe was utilised in ancient Greece and beyond for its psychotropic qualities, with recent research pointing to its sedative, anxiolytic and antidepressant properties, and the possibilities of its future application. In Pliny's account, I think it's in the Natural History, mistletoe was regarded as the oak tree's genitals. He records its collecting in Gaul, with druids performing a complex ritual emasculation, as Graves puts it, using a golden sickle to cut the mistletoe from the tree, with the juice of its berries referred to as oak sperm. Golden sickle, a sickle. We find this instrument again in the scant fragments we have of Sophocles' rhizotomoi, root cutters, in which Medea is presented naked, chanting and averting her eyes as she collects, as one version has it, the silvery secretion oozing from the root of a plant sliced open with a bronze sickle. The sickle is an instrument worthy of considerable attention. In 1961, Lacan will highlight its presence at the end of Hugo's Boer's Sleeping, a work, as we know, he makes much of, stating, "What we glimpse, in effect, at the end of the poem is what is expressed by that wonderful image with which it concludes." And Ruth wondered, lying motionless and half opening her eye beneath her veils, what god, what harvester of eternal summer had, in departing, negligently thrown this golden sickle into the field of stars. And he notes here how the sickle, with which Kronos castrated Uranus, he adds, which we could position as the first, the original castration, couldn't fail to be included at the end of this complete constellation that constitutes the paternity complex. Prior to this, in 1957, in Seminar 4, he takes the sickle as the symbol of the castration complex in the formula he develops that situates the essential moment of the crossing of the Oedipus complex, as he moves towards the full formula of the paternal metaphor. Here the C crescent stands for the sickle, which itself serves to denote the castration complex. At a somewhat different level, we can point to its crucial role in the Neolithic Revolution, assisting in the transition to farming and a crop-based lifestyle. Indeed, from this one could argue quite easily that the sickle figures as central to the emergence of civilization. No castration, no civilization and its discontents, no civilization, no castration. We should note as well its presence in votive offerings, in regard to which we can ask whether such practices can't be configured as the attempt to enact, to mark and designate imaginary castration, the attempt to, avant la lettre, pre-analytic knowledge, bring this about. The Frankelben hoard, unearthed in 1946 with its 300 sickles, provides a particularly rich example of this. Many of the sickles found there carry line-shaped marks following a defined pattern that has been interpreted as a proto-writing system, possibly forming calendar pages, presenting the oldest known sign system in Central Europe. There's more that could be discussed here, with the sickle presenting itself to us as a giant question mark, if you like, of the type Lacan points to the graph of desire forming as it moves towards its final form. But I'll rein myself in. It's a very Lacanian object. The second medication we spoke about last time, mandrake. The gathering of mandrake involved multiple versions of rituals and was associated with numerous stories and beliefs. This includes, in German folklore, assigning the alias name Galgenmännlein, Little Man of the Gallows, to mandrake, based on the belief that the plant springs from the ground beneath a hanged man where his urine or semen had dripped into the ground. And according to folklore, reaching back at least as far as Josephus and found across Europe, when the root is dug up, it screams and kills all who hear it, so that a dog must be attached to the root and made to pull it out. Here in this image from circa 512 we see Dioscorides, the father of pharmacology, presented with a mandrake root by Heresis, the personification of discovery, who points to the dead animal at her feet. The plant's uncanny associations, the inanimate becoming animate, are only added to here, invoking the dimension of castration that Lacan in Seminar 10 locates as underpinning the uncanny, and raising the question of the terms in which castration is at play in the subject's relation to their double. We can find castration present in the application and use of medications as well. Here we can turn to the figure I've already mentioned of Melampus, Blackfoot, the legendary healer and seer originally of Pylos, who would go on to rule Argos. As I've already noted, according to the myth, Melampus could understand the language of the animals, possessing a knowledge of the real given by two young snakes he had rescued, and who either licked or entered his ears while he was asleep. And we find it present in his treatment of Iphyclus, son of King Phylacus of Phylace, who suffered from impotence. Melampus sacrifices 2 bulls and listens to the 2 vultures this brought. 2 snakes, 2 bulls, 2 vultures. Freud will indicate the 2 is enough to constitute polyphallicism, to reference castration, and, we might say, to position Melampus as a 3rd. But the other, the big other, or the father, the latter follows more clearly from castration. But the former, the other, is suggestive of the formation of a knowledge that will reach beyond this case. The relation of the big other to the father remains, I think we can say, quite under-elaborated. To return to the 2 vultures, they discuss how last time they were here, King Phylacus had been gelding rams. The child Iphyclus saw his father coming toward him with a big blood-stained knife, as one account has it, took fright and screamed. The king tossed the knife aside or drove it into a tree for safekeeping, so he could go and comfort his son. It injured a hamadryad, the nymph bonded to a particular tree, who cursed the prince with impotence. The vultures reveal what needs to be done. The knife had to be removed from the trunk of the tree and heated in boiling wine, which the patient should then drink for 10 days. The treatment is successful, and Iphyclus is able to have a son, Podarchus. The Freudian resonances of this myth have been picked up on by Proetus and Sucadis in the psychocathartic method of treatment of Iphyclus's impotence from 1955. It would be wrong to pass over another of Melampus's famous cases, this time involving his treatment of women. At the invitation of King Proetus of Argolis, Melampus cured his 3 daughters, whom Dionysus had turned mad for their refusal to worship him, leaving them wandering in the mountains, behaving strangely, versions differ, hallucinating and thinking they'd become cows. He allowed them to dance and scream, believing that in this way the women's frenzy would diffuse. He then purged the young women with an extract of hellebore roots and made sure they bathed in purifying river waters. This case has been quite extensively discussed. There's a long body of literature on it from which we can glean a certain amount. Take Pharmacology and Psychiatry at the Origins of Greek Medicine, The Myth of Melampus and the Madness of the Proetides by Oliveri et al. From 2016, which, in terms of the section on retrospective diagnosis, descends into a delirium of diagnoses that is itself exemplary in terms of the routes diagnosis can take when there's no structural reference to anchor it, but which contains much to think over, even if it's somewhat coy on questions of sexuality, marriage and the feminine, preferring to point to the ancient authors who discuss these questions. Can we see castration at play here? This returns us to the question of the relation of purgation to castration I pointed to last time. As Lacan will note in Seminar 10 in discussing the anal object, the excremental A has come within the scope of our attention in as much as it symbolises castration, adding the evacuation of the result of the anal function in as much as it is done on command, as it is here we can see Melampus induces it with hellebore, will take on its full import at the phallic level as providing an image of the loss of the phallus. Seminar 10 owes a significant debt to inhibitions, symptoms and anxiety, of course, and as Freud will state there, castration can be pictured on the basis of the daily experience of the faeces being separated from the body. The notion then that medicine can operate as an agent of castration, or might work to support this operation. What do we mean by this? In what sense can this be the case? At one level, we can position this in terms of medication constituting an agent or entity that acts upon the subject to reduce and limit jouissance, as in, to start with, and to put it in the most general terms, the jouissance of the subject's suffering. To begin to refine this, we need to note the variety of forms this can take, from mania, catatonic excitation, the excessive forms of bodily excitation we can find in the schizophrenias, but not only there, to modes of anxiety and dread, to forms of depression and catatonic stupor. This list isn't exhaustive, but indicates the range of forms this jouissance can take. In each of these, and let's not ignore how each is refracted through or takes shape at the level of the singularity of the subject's experience, we can find a different emanation of jouissance. An assertion that, at one level, should remind us how underdeveloped is our conception of jouissance, or jouissances, how rarely we encounter this term used in the plural, and yet it exists in the French, les jouissances. How, we can ask ourselves, can we speak of these states of suffering without speaking of jouissance, as if jouissance could be excluded from them? In the previous video, I pointed to the significance of benumbing in the history of psychotropics, and we can see the attempt to reduce and limit the jouissance of these states as a key function of these medications. In the case of antipsychotics, their tranquilizing effects are quite clearly directed at one level towards the reduction of excitation and jouissance, but sedatives, anxiolytics, sleeping pills, antidepressants and mood stabilizers all achieve or seek to achieve a reduction in or limiting of the jouissances of suffering. This is clear. To which we can also point to the reduction in libido, in sexual desire and sexual jouissance that so frequently constitutes a side effect of psychotropic medications, including antipsychotics and SSRIs and related medications. Should we position this as a side effect of these medications, or is it the case that this should be regarded as a dimension of their efficacy, that the limiting of sexual jouissance can't be untangled from these medications' function? Sexual jouissance invokes the jouissance of the big other, as the realm of fantasy makes clear, and the terms in which medication might serve to limit the jouissance of the other can't, of course, be separated out from the forms of jouissance we encounter in the versions of suffering I've just pointed to. This jouissance of the other emanates from, maybe not always entirely, but we can say principally or in principle, it depends exactly how other is taken here, the subject-child's relation to the mother and the maternal thing, a relation in which the child's being the phallus for the mother is central. This is one major line in which we see castration as it operates in the analytic treatment, and as we've been speaking about, serves or seeks to intervene, thereby reducing and or limiting the subject-child's relation to the mother and developing the former's separation from the latter. Can we speak, though, of the castrative effects of medication reaching beyond the containing or reduction of jouissance? We should be wary of trying to draw too clear dividing lines between jouissance and everything else. But we can point to the way in which medications can serve to alter the thinking, the cognition, conscious at least, that accompanies, that fuels and feeds off suffering and its jouissance. Let me take an example that'll clarify what I mean. In Van Putten et al.'s The Wish to be Crazy paper that I spoke of last time, the authors point to a medication's capacity to reduce the patient's sense of grandiosity as a key reason for their refusing or discontinuing medication, the typical antipsychotics they were prescribed. They cite the case of a 30-year-old man who was readmitted for the 19th time because of florid psychosis. He spoke of being a composer, of having billions, and of being the greatest aeronautical engineer in the world, registering a grandiosity rating of 6, severe on the 1 to 7 brief psychiatric rating scale, the authors add. While receiving flofenazine, he was, the authors state, objectively globally improved. Subjectively, he seemed to resent the increased reality contact. He started to mention his loneliness and his realistic lack of any life accomplishments, and developed some insight into his illness. At this point, he demanded to leave the hospital and resumed living in a lonely hotel. He returned for only one injection of flofenazine and was readmitted 3 months later, psychotic as before. The castration effects of the flofenazine on the subject's thinking appear quite clear here. In addition, we can point to the way in which all medications, and not just psychotropics, serve to reference castration in invoking the subject's vulnerability and frailty, that they're lacking something, and their need for or reliance on something other than themselves, something beyond themselves. You're up in arms at this point, I'm sure. Castration, though, is, as Lacan conceives it, a symbolic operation, I hear you cry. How then, in what terms can we speak of medication that doesn't speak, that's silent, that seemingly swerves the symbolic and signification, operating in these terms? As I've already outlined, medication entails treating the real with the real. Medication acts upon the subject's real, their body, their drives, their jouissance, but its effects are not confined to this. In acting upon the subject's real, medication can have effects at the level of the imaginary and the symbolic, as we see in the case of the 30-year-old man discussed by Van Putten et al. Or, to take another basic example, a depressed subject doesn't speak or speaks very little, and when they do, their speech is empty, lacking in any feeling. The symbolic is denuded. An SNRI, let's say, serves to reduce their depressive affects. One result being they start to speak more. They start to speak in a different way than they have been. What they say is imbued with more meaning and effect for them, which may include the capacity to engage in analytic work in a way they weren't previously able to, and to experience the castrative effects this brings. But, as well, as Lacan will discuss in Seminar 10, seemingly against, as he might appear to hint at, a conception of how his work might be perceived, it's the real of the body from which the subject's relation to the symbolic must ultimately derive. As he will state, it's precisely to the status of the object petitr, that one ought to turn to give the symbolic the exact place that falls to it in the constitution and translation of experience. As he continues, the problem is one of the signifier's entry into the real and of seeing how the subject is born from this. Does this mean that we find ourselves before some kind of descent of the spirit, a kind of apparition of winged signifiers, that they would start making their holes in the real all by themselves? I think that when I introduce the division between the real, the imaginary, and the symbolic, no one attributes such a design to me. And then, today, the point is to know precisely what allows the signifier to be incarnated. What allows it to be incarnated is first and foremost what we've got here by which to presentify ourselves to one another, our body. End of quotes. To take a fundamentalist in extremis example of this, it's too good not to reference the Sumerians' base 60 sexagesimal system of counting. It's been pretty influential temporally and spatially. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees, derives from the shape, structure and limits of the fingers and hands. In terms of medication as treating the real with the real, then, we should be aware of how, in treating this level at which the signifier is incarnated, medication, in its altering of the real, in the production of, to refer to the formula from the previous video, double primar, will bring about effects. Perhaps we could say produce a shifting, a tilting of the subject's relation to the domains of the symbolic and the imaginary. In the saying this, when we speak in this way, at this level, are we saying very much? We'll find out as we move on. We're going to take up and question further the relation of medication to castration in the next talk. If you liked this video, click on like and subscribe to the channel.